Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're going to dig into an incident that really, it just tore a city apart and pitted local and federal governments against each other. And it all started with a single fatal gunshot.
And that's really the million-dollar question, isn't it? How does a shooting on what seems like a quiet residential street in Minneapolis just explode into this national political firestorm? Well, it started with the incident, of course, but it was the reaction, the immediate reaction, that really poured gasoline on the fire.
I mean, just look at this. This wasn't some quiet press release or a carefully worded tweet. This was the mayor of a major American city, just hours after the shooting, telling a federal law enforcement agency to get out. It's a statement that drew a massive line in the sand and, it just set the stage for this huge political conflict.
All right, so let's break it down to what we know for sure, the undisputed facts. On a Wednesday morning, 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good was in her vehicle when she was shot and killed. The person who pulled the trigger? An officer with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE.
And from that one single tragic event, two completely different versions of what happened just immediately sprang up. I mean, we're talking radically different stories, which, as you can imagine, created a ton of confusion and division right from the get-go.
So on one side, you have the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, calling it an act of domestic terrorism. And on the other, you have local officials and critics calling it a murder, a state-sanctioned execution. The gap between those two descriptions, it's a canyon. So let's look a little closer at the exact words they were using.
The federal government story was really clear, and they stuck to it. You can see it right here in the statement from DHS Secretary Noem. They painted a picture of Renee Good as a dangerous agitator who was stalking and impeding their agents before she weaponized her vehicle. The whole thing was framed as a very clear-cut case of self-defense.
But on the flip side, critics were saying, no way. They were pointing to video evidence and arguing that it showed something completely different, a picture of excessive, deadly force being used against a citizen.
Okay, so to really get why these two stories are so wildly different, you have to look at the people at the very center of it all. Renee Good and Officer Jonathan Ross.
So first you have Renee Good. According to her own social media and what her family said, she was a 37-year-old mom, a wife, a published poet, a university graduate. Her mother was adamant that she was not involved in any kind of protest activities.
But then you hear this completely different story, this one from local residents at a vigil for her. They described Good as a trained activist, a warrior even, with a group called Ice Watch that, well, they document and resist the agency. This totally contradicts her family's statements and just adds another really complex layer to who she was.
And the officer who fired the weapon? That was Jonathan Ross. Federal officials, all the way up to the vice president, they came out and defended him as a seasoned 10-year veteran just doing a very dangerous job.
But here's where things get really interesting, a crucial piece of his backstory. Just 6 months before this shooting, Officer Ross was severely injured in an incident that was, strikingly similar. It also involved a vehicle being used as a weapon.
100 yards. Just imagine that for a second. That's the distance Officer Ross was dragged by a car while his arm was trapped inside. It was a brutal assault that left him with 33 stitches, so he had firsthand, and very recent, experience with exactly how dangerous a vehicle could be.
So you can see how that past trauma is a huge part of the federal narrative. But back on the ground in Minneapolis, the focus was all on what was happening right now. The fallout from the shooting was immediate and it was intense. It went from a local story to a national political battle in just a matter of hours.
And this timeline, it just shows you how incredibly fast everything went off the rails. You go from the shooting in the morning to protests and the mayor telling ICE to leave that same afternoon. By that night, thousands are at a vigil. The city was on an absolute knife's edge. And in less than 48 hours, you have school closures and a major power struggle between the state and the Fed.
Now, to really get the federal government side of this, you kind of got to zoom out a little. They don't see this as just one isolated incident. As this data from DHS shows, they are dealing with a staggering increase in threats against their agents. I mean, look at these numbers. Assaults, vehicle attacks, death threats, they're all through the roof. In this wider context, it really helps explain why their reaction was so swift and so severe.
So, with all this division, this high-stakes political drama, it's really no surprise that the investigation itself became its own battlefield.
What happened was the FBI basically came in and said, "We've got this," citing jurisdiction. And in doing so, they completely sidelined Minnesota's main investigative agency. It was a move that local officials called, highly unusual and deeply concerning.
And you can just hear the frustration in Minnesota Governor Tim Walz's voice here. He basically argued that since federal officials had already made up their minds, already called it domestic terrorism, how could a purely federal investigation possibly be trusted to be fair and impartial?
And here is where things get really tricky, legally speaking. There's this concept in law called absolute immunity. You can think of it like a legal shield for federal officers. It means that even if the state of Minnesota wanted to bring charges against Officer Ross, the case would almost certainly be moved to a federal court. And if that court decides he was acting within the scope of his job, the whole case could just be dismissed. It makes getting a state-level conviction incredibly difficult.
So this is where we're left. You've got two sides that see the exact same event in fundamentally different ways. The investigation itself is a huge point of conflict. It leaves us with this final, really vital question. In a situation this polarized, what does justice even look like? And can a single, trusted truth ever emerge?